The pen scratched once across the paper. Termination. Signed. Miranda Shaw slid it across the desk without looking up. Pack your things. You're done here. Dr. Caleb Hartman didn't argue. He picked up his box, a worn stethoscope, a photo of his 8-year-old daughter, one dented badge he'd never told a soul about, and carried it past every colleague who suddenly found something else to stare at. The single dad had just been fired by his CEO, humiliated, erased in under 2 minutes. He didn't make it to his car. The sirens hit first, then the crash of gurneys, then a voice screaming his name across the parking lot. Hours later, they'd all learn what Miranda had thrown away, and it would save 37 lives. The morning started the way most of them did, with a small hand tugging his sleeve before the alarm even rang. Dad. My hair's doing the thing again. Caleb Hartman opened one eye. Sophie stood beside the bed in her school uniform, holding a hairbrush like it was a live grenade one side of her head, flat where she'd slept on it. 8 years old, and already convinced that a bad hair day was a genuine medical emergency. He almost told her that. Instead, he sat up, took the brush, and went to work on the tangle, while she narrated the entire plot of a cartoon he had never seen and would never see. This was the part of the day nobody at Crestview General knew about. To them, Dr. Hartman was the emergency physician, who drifted in a few minutes past the hour with coffee he never finished, and a reason he never gave. They saw a man who couldn't keep a schedule. They didn't see the braid he learned to do off a video tutorial after his wife died, the lunch he packed while checking a fever, the way he timed every red light between the elementary school and the ambulance bay down to the second. He got Sophie's hair into something that would survive until recess poured cereal signed a permission slip for a field trip. He was fairly sure he couldn't chaperone, and moved through it all with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done far harder things in far worse places. He never talked about those places. There was a small dented badge in the back of his desk drawer at the hospital, buried under a spare pair of gloves, and that was the only trace of them he allowed to exist. 5 years as a field surgeon had taught him a great deal about keeping people alive, and one thing about himself that he did not want to be looked at, the way people looked at men who had seen what he'd seen. So he let them think he was just a doctor who couldn't get out of bed on time. The morning came apart at the front door. Sophie's forehead was warm. Not alarmingly warm, but warm in the way that meant a real fever by noon, and the neighbor who watched her on emergencies wasn't answering. Caleb stood in the doorway with his keys in one hand and his daughter's flushed face in the other, running the math every single parent knows by heart, the math where every option costs something you can't afford. He got her settled on the neighbor's couch 12 minutes past the time he was supposed to be clocking in, kissed the top of her head and drove to the hospital, knowing the whole way that 12 minutes was going to matter. He had no idea how much. Miranda Shaw had been running Crestview General for 6 months, and in that time, she had learned to read the building like a balance sheet. She came from the world of numbers, margins, throughput quarterly targets, and she believed with the clean certainty of someone who had never watched a person die on a table that a hospital was simply a machine that ran well or ran badly, depending on whether its people followed the rules. She was not a cruel woman. She would have been genuinely offended by the suggestion. She was something more dangerous than cruel, she was certain. The board that had hired her wanted discipline. They wanted the losses stopped and the culture tightened, and they wanted to see it happen fast enough to put in a report. Miranda had built her career on giving people like that exactly what they asked for. She had spent the past week building a case study in accountability, a clean example she could point to, and when the shift log flagged Dr. Hartman clocking in, late for the 4th time that month, she felt something almost like relief. Here was her example. Here was a name attached to a pattern attached to a policy she could enforce in front of everyone, so the enforcing only had to happen once. She had his file open on her desk when he arrived. She had not read the parts that mattered. The 9 years. The commendations from patients who'd written in specifically to say, This doctor sat with my mother when no one else would. The quiet fact that Dr. Hartman took the shifts no one else wanted, the overnight traumas, the holiday runs, because a man with nowhere to be after work is worth his weight in a place that never closes. None of that was in the column she was looking at. The column she was looking at said late, and it said it 4 times. Caleb knew the moment he saw the message on his pager. Report to administration. Not the charge nurse, not scheduling. Administration. Miranda didn't ask him to sit. She let him stand on the other side of the desk, like a man waiting for a verdict, which he was, and she opened with the word she'd rehearsed. Reliability, she said. That's the entire job, Dr. Hartman. People walk through those doors on the worst day of their lives, and they need to know someone will be here. Not someone who might be. Someone who will. I understand that. If I could explain. I've read the log. I don't need the explanation. She turned a page she wasn't reading. This is the 4th time this month. I have nurses who take 3 buses to get here and clock in early. I have residents sleeping in the on-call room so they're never a minute behind. And I have you strolling in whenever your morning allows it, treating a shift schedule like a suggestion. He kept his voice level. He was good at that. My daughter was sick this morning. I'm a single father. Some mornings the timing is, everyone has a life. She said it the way you'd swat something. Everyone. If I let every personal situation rewrite the schedule, I don't have a hospital, I have a daycare with a pharmacy. A hospital cannot run on one man's excuses. There it was. Excuses. He watched her file the whole of him under that one word. The braids, the fevers, the red lights counted down the 9 years, and something in him that had survived a great many things simply chose not to fight this one. There was no argument to be made to a person who had already decided. He'd learned that in rooms far worse than this. So that's it, he said. Not a question. That's it. She was already signing. The pen moved across the page in one confident stroke, the sound of it louder in the small office than it had any right to be. She slid the paper across the desk without quite meeting his eyes. Pack your things. You're done here. He looked at the letter for a moment. Then he picked it up, folded it once, and left without another word. And it was the not arguing that unsettled her, though she couldn't have said why. She had expected pleading. She had prepared for anger. She had not prepared for a man who simply accepted it and walked out with his spine straight as though being treated unfairly was a familiar country he already knew how to travel. The floor knew before he reached it. Bad news moves through a hospital faster than any code. By the time Caleb got to the desk that had been his for 9 years, the noise had dropped into that particular hush of people pretending very hard to be busy. A resident he'd trained found something fascinating on a clipboard. 2 nurses he'd covered shifts for 12 times each studied a monitor that wasn't alarming. Nobody looked at him. Nobody knew what to say to a man who'd been erased before lunch, so they gave him the small mercy of not watching, which is also a way of not standing up for someone. He found a cardboard box in the supply room and packed the way he did everything without wasted motion. The worn stethoscope his wife had given him the day he matched the one he'd kept, even after the tubing cracked, because some things you keep. A few pens. And from the very back of the drawer under the spare gloves, the small dented badge that no one in this building had ever seen or asked about, and that he slid into the box face down so it would stay that way. He reached last for the framed photo on the desk, Sophie gap-toothed, squinting into the sun. But in his hurry, it slipped from his fingers, skidded off the edge, and came to rest face down on the floor near the desk leg. He was already lifting the box and turning toward the door. He never saw it fall. He carried the box down the hall and out through the lobby past the sliding glass doors into a morning that had turned bright and ordinary and cruel in its indifference. The parking lot shimmered with early heat. Somewhere, a car alarm chirped, and went silent. He set the box on the hood of his car and stood there, keys in hand. And for the first time all morning, he didn't know what came next. He didn't know how he'd tell Sophie. He didn't know what he'd do about the mortgage, the insurance that had just walked out the door with his job, the small, careful life he'd built out of braids and fevers and shifts no one else wanted. 9 years, and it fit in a box on the hood of a used sedan. Back upstairs, Miranda was already moving on. She'd carried the signed letter out of her office to hand to human resources walking the floor, the way she liked to letting people see that the rules had teeth now. She was crossing near the empty desk when a nurse bent down beside it and came up holding something. The photograph he'd dropped still lay where it had fallen face down by the desk leg until the nurse turned it over to set it aside and return it to him later. It was the little girl, gap-toothed, squinting into the sun. Miranda looked at it for less than a second. A child's face. She registered it the way you register a stranger's photo in a wallet you're handing back briefly without weight, and she kept walking the letter still warm in her hand. And she did not let herself think the word father, and she did not connect the girl in the photo to the excuse she'd swatted out of the air an hour before. It wasn't callousness exactly, it was efficiency. Feeling the full weight of every person she managed would have made her job impossible, so she had trained herself not to, and she was very good at her job. She would remember that photograph before the day was over. She would remember it with a specific sinking clarity standing in the middle of a disaster she didn't yet know was coming, and she would understand then exactly what she'd been too certain to see. But that was hours away. For now the morning was quiet. Caleb stood in the parking lot beside his box. Miranda walked the letter to HR. Somewhere across the city on a construction site, running behind schedule, men were bolting the last sections onto a scaffold that had not been inspected on time, and the metal was already beginning to sing under a load it was never built to hold. Nobody heard it yet, but it was coming. He was reaching for the door handle when the first siren cut across the parking lot. Caleb didn't turn right away. Sirens were the ordinary weather of his life. He'd stopped flinching at them years ago. But this one didn't come alone. A second joined it, then a third, then a sound underneath all of them that made the small hairs on his arms stand up the low-layered wail of every unit in the county being called at once. He'd heard that particular chord exactly twice before in his life, and both times had been on the other side of the world, in a tent that smelled of canvas and iodine, waiting for the helicopters to come in heavy. He turned around. The ambulances were already pouring into the bay, more of them than the bay was built to hold, backing up onto the access road, with their doors flung open before they'd fully stopped. He could see the crews moving wrong too fast. Not enough hands, the frantic economy of people who have already realized there are more patients than there are people to carry them. A rig jumped the curb to get past the one ahead of it. Somewhere, a dispatcher's voice crackled through an open cab, and he caught fragments, scaffold collapse, mass casualty, and a number that didn't sound real. His body knew before his mind agreed. The box still sat on the hood where he'd left it. His feet were already moving. He crossed the lot at a jog, then a run, falling in beside a gurney as it came off the back of the nearest rig. A young man, maybe 20, gray, as ash, a length of rebar still lodged below his collarbone, and the crew packing gauze around it, without a plan for what came next. Caleb's hands were on the packing before he'd made a decision to touch it, reading the wound the way another man reads a familiar face. Survivable. Barely. Wrong angle on the pressure. Don't pull the packing tight over the entry, you'll see the bleed inside, he heard himself say, in a voice he hadn't used in years, the flat, clear command voice that carried without shouting. Pressure proximal. Here. Now. The medic obeyed on instinct the way people obey that voice, and the gray of the young man's face held instead of deepening. Then a hand closed on Caleb's arm and stopped him at the sliding doors. Sir. A security guard, young big, doing exactly what he'd been told to do that morning. "Sir, I can't let you in. Your access is pulled. You're not staff anymore." The doors kept sliding open and shut on the guard's shoulder, and through them, Caleb could see the lobby past him, and it was already coming apart. Gurneys crowded 3 deep, blood on the tile in the long, smeared arcs that meant someone had been dragged. A nurse he knew by name spinning in place looking for a doctor and finding none free. And above it all, the thin electronic scream of a monitor finding a rhythm it didn't like. "My badge is dead," Caleb said. "I know. Look at what's happening in there." "I have my orders." The guard's voice cracked on it. He wasn't a bad man either. This building was full of people who weren't bad following orders, that were about to get someone killed. That was when Miranda came through the inner doors. She had heard the sirens from the administrative wing and come down expecting to manage a situation, to stand where staff could see her being calm, to project the competent stillness she believed her job required. What she walked into buckled that belief in the first 3 seconds. She had never seen anything like it. The lobby of her hospital, her clean machine was a slaughterhouse with fluorescent lighting, and the machine was seizing. Her people were drowning. A resident she'd praised in a meeting last week stood frozen over a patient with both hands raised, unable to choose. Miranda's certainty the thing she ran on met a wall of screaming and blood and simply had nowhere to go. And then she saw him. Caleb Hartman at her doors, the man she'd erased before lunch with blood already on his sleeves, and both hands moving toward a patient he had no authorization to touch. Something in her reached purely by reflex for the only tool she trusted. Order. Procedure. The chain of command she'd spent 6 months tightening. "Get him out," she said. It came out sharp and certain and horribly small against the noise. "He doesn't work here. He's a liability. Get him away from these patients." The guard tightened his grip. Caleb didn't fight it. He looked at Miranda across 10 feet of the worst morning of both their lives, and he didn't argue because he never argued, and the not arguing was worse than anything he could have said. He simply let the guard hold him and looked past her at the dying and let her see that he was letting her win. For one long moment, that was where it stood. A CEO's word against a catastrophe. And the catastrophe was going to keep her word. Then a rescue worker burst out through the inner doors, and everything turned. He couldn't have been more than 25, one of the crews that had ridden in with the first wave, and he was covered in other people's blood to the elbows, his eyes wide and wet and searching. He'd been inside. He'd seen what was happening to the ones being carried in last, the quiet ones, the ones not screaming because they'd stopped being able to. He grabbed the frame of the door to keep himself upright, and his voice broke across the whole lobby. "We need somebody who knows mass casualty. Now. We've got people dying in the hallway because nobody's sorting them. We're working the loud ones, and the quiet ones are going gray, and I don't." His voice climbed and cracked. "Somebody has to run this. Please. Anybody." His eyes swept the room and landed on the one man standing still, with the certainty of someone who knew the answer. On Caleb. "You," the young man said. "You were out here telling them how to pack the rebar guy. You know how to do this. Please." Every face in the lobby turned. The guard's grip loosened without him deciding to loosen it, and Caleb stood at the threshold of a place that had thrown him out that morning, holding in his hands the oldest choice he knew. He could walk away. He had every right to. They had humiliated him, erased 9 years in under 2 minutes, and turned his own colleagues into people who wouldn't meet his eyes. Not one of those patients on the tile was his problem now. He could pick up his box off the hood of his car, drive to the neighbor's house, hold his daughter, and let this building live with what it had done. It would have been fair. It would have been the most understandable thing in the world. He thought about the box on the hood. He thought about Sophie's warm forehead that morning. He thought for one flickering instant of a different set of doors, a very long way from here, and of all the times he hadn't gotten to choose who lived. Then he looked at the young rescue worker's ruined face and he thought about the thing that had always been true underneath everything else, the thing the badge in his box stood for, that the people bleeding on the floor were not part of what had been done to him. His fight was with a signature on a page, not with them. They were just people, and they were dying, and he knew how to stop it. He shrugged the guard's hand off his arm gently, almost kindly, and stepped through the doors. "Show me the worst ones first," he told the rescue worker, and walked into the hospital that had fired him. Nobody stopped him, not even Miranda. She opened her mouth and the order died in it, because some deep and unwilling part of her had already understood that if she made them drag him out now, she would be choosing procedure over these lives in front of everyone, and she would have to live with the arithmetic of that for the rest of her career. So she said nothing, and hated that she said nothing, and watched the man she'd fired walk past her into the eye of it. What happened next, Miranda would spend a long time trying to describe to herself and never quite manage. He didn't run. That was the first thing. Everyone else in the room was running, and he walked, and somehow the walking covered ground faster. He crossed the lobby, taking it apart with his eyes, and by the time he reached the center of it, he had already decided things the rest of them hadn't known needed deciding. "Stop working that one," he said it to the frozen resident, and the resident flinched. "He's talking, he's pink. He can wait 20 minutes. This one," he was already 3 feet away, crouched over a woman nobody had looked at, because she'd made no noise at all. "This one is bleeding into her belly, and she's about to arrest, and none of you saw her because she's polite." His hands moved over her quick, certain. "You, get her to a table. Go." He straightened and turned in a slow circle, and the circle was the thing that changed the room. He was building something in the air that none of them could see, yet a map, a triage, an order of operations wrenched out of chaos. "I need 3 zones," he called out, and his voice cut through without rising the flat command carry of a man who had done this under mortar fire. "Immediate delayed, and the ones we can't help. Tape on the floor if you have to. Red here, yellow along that wall. Anyone not breathing on their own comes to me first in the order they stop." He caught a passing nurse by the shoulder. "You're my runner. You don't stop, you carry my words across this room and you come back. Understood." She nodded wide-eyed and ran. He was speaking a language most of them had only read about. He tagged patients with a flick of his hand and a single word, expectant, immediate minor moving through the wounded, the way a surgeon moves through a body, and the room began impossibly to organize itself around him. The loud ones got quieter, the quiet ones got found. A rhythm emerged out of the screaming, and the rhythm was his. Off to the side, a nurse near the supply cart said it under her breath, to the resident beside her, the question the whole floor was starting to ask. Where does an ER doc learn to run a scene like that? And the resident watching Caleb reach a man 20 feet away and know before he touched him that the leg was the least of his problems didn't have an answer. Nobody talked about it out loud yet. But the question was in the room, now moving from one exhausted face to the next gathering weight. Not everyone obeyed. A few of the staff hesitated when his orders reached them, glancing toward the doors toward Miranda, remembering that this man had been fired that very morning and technically had no right to command anyone. One physician, older territorial, actually said it. "You don't have privileges here anymore. Hartman, you can't just..." And Caleb didn't even turn his head. "Then you run it," he said. "Right now. Tell me who gets the next open table. Tell me which of these 2 arrests we work. Go ahead." The man said nothing. He had no answer because the answer required something he didn't have, and everyone standing near enough to hear it understood the exchange for what it was. Authority isn't the badge. In a room full of dying people, authority is the one person who knows what to do next. From that moment, whatever the paperwork said, the room belonged to Caleb. It held together for the better part of an hour. Barely, and at a cost, but it held. He kept the map alive in his head and moved through the wounded, and the room moved with him, and one by one the immediate cases went from the floor to the tables, and off his list, and the number of people who were going to die that morning began slowly to shrink. Then they wheeled in the last two. They came off the same collapsed section found together under the same fallen span, and they arrived within seconds of each other on gurneys, pushed by crews who'd already used everything they had. 2 men, both crushed through the chest, both drowning in their own lungs, oxygen starving out of them by the second, both of them at the exact edge, where a machine breathing for them was the only thing between here and gone. And there was one ventilator left. Caleb knew it the instant he saw them, because he'd been tracking the equipment in the same part of his mind that tracked everything, and the count was the count. Every other machine was working, keeping someone else alive, and could not be moved without killing the person it was breathing for. There were no free hands to breathe for a man by force. Either every nurse, every spare set of arms, every mask in the room was already committed to someone. 1 ventilator, 2 men who needed it in the next 90 seconds, or they would not need anything ever again. The room felt it happen. The runner nurse stopped beside him with her hands full and went still. The young rescue worker, the one who'd begged him in, stood at the foot of the 2 gurneys and looked from one gray face to the other, and then up at Caleb with something like horror, because he understood the math now too, and he was grateful past words that it wasn't his to solve. Caleb had done this before. That was the terrible part, the part none of them knew. He had stood in exactly this place, with exactly this arithmetic, more times than a person should survive. And the doing of it again didn't get easier. It got heavier, each one stacking on the last. He looked at the 2 men. One was older, mid-50s, a wedding ring worn thin, and his numbers were bad, and getting worse in a straight line down. The other was younger, stronger, and his injuries were worse on paper, but his body was still fighting, still clawing the vitals, ragged but not yet surrendering. 2 seconds. He had 2 seconds, and he took them, and in those 2 seconds, he did the calculation he hated most in the world, not who deserved it, never that there was no deserving in it, but who the machine could still save. The older man was too far down the slope. The ventilator would breathe for a body that was already leaving. The younger one the machine might hold. The machine might be a bridge to a table to a surgeon to years. The young one, he said. Vent goes to the young one. Now. They moved. The mask came down over the younger man's face, and the machine took over the work of living, and his ragged numbers steadied a fraction enough a bridge. Caleb dropped to a knee beside the older man himself. He would not make the runner do it. He took the man's hand, and he did the only thing left to do, which was to make sure that a stranger did not die alone on a cold floor in a crowded room. He stayed there through it, a hand around a hand, while the rest of the disaster went on 10 feet away, and he felt the grip loosen and go. And he closed the man's eyes with 2 fingers, the way he'd learned to a long time ago. And he stood back up because there were still people who could be saved, and grief was a thing you did later. He carried that one. He would carry it for a long time. But he stood back up, and that was the moment his phone rang. It shouldn't have gotten through. He barely registered it at first. One more sound, in a room made of sound. But it kept ringing, insistent against his hip, and some animal part of a father's brain that never fully switches off made him look. The neighbor's number. And every other thought in his head went white. Sophie. He stepped back from the table, tore a glove off with his teeth, and answered, and the neighbor's voice came through thin and frightened. The fever had climbed. It had climbed fast higher than a fever should go. And Sophie was crying and hot to the touch and asking for her dad. And the neighbor didn't know what to do and was scared to wait. Caleb Hartman stood in the middle of the worst morning of his career, in a room full of strangers. He was keeping alive with the phone pressed to his ear, and his own child, burning up on the other end of it. Two worlds, and he was the only bridge across both, and his hand, the hand that had been steady through rebar and arrest, and a man dying under his fingers. That hand was shaking now, finally over a fever. He looked at the room, immediate cases still on the floor, the map still alive only because he was standing in the middle of it, holding it together. If he walked out that door to his daughter, some of these people would die in the gap he left. If he stayed, his little girl would burn alone across the city, asking for a father who didn't come. He made the only choice a man like him could make, which was to refuse the choice. He caught the runner nurse by the arm and spoke fast and low. "Listen to me. My daughter's sick. My neighbor's bringing her in. She needs to come here right now to this ER. Do you understand? I need someone to call the neighbor back. Give her this address. Tell her to drive." He was already turning back toward the wounded, even as he said it. "Her name is Sophie. Sophie Hartman. When she gets here, you find me. You come and you find me no matter what I'm doing." The nurse nodded and ran, and Caleb put the phone away and picked the map back up out of the air where he'd dropped it, and became a doctor again, with his daughter now racing toward the same doors he was fighting to hold. Father and physician in one body, with no seam between them anymore. He did not see Miranda. She was standing at the mouth of the emergency department, exactly where she'd been for a while now, unable to leave, unable to help, watching the whole thing through the same doorway she'd tried to have him dragged out of an hour before. She had seen all of it. The walk that covered ground faster than anyone's running. The room organizing itself around one man. The two gurneys and the one machine, and the terrible 2 seconds, and the older man's hand going still under Caleb's. She had watched the physician with real privileges fall silent because he had no answer. And she had understood, with a slowly rising nausea, what that silence meant about her own certainty. And she had heard carried across the room on the runner's relay the name, Sophie Hartman, a little girl, on her way here. Miranda's mind went unbidden to a photograph she'd walked past that morning without letting it weigh anything, a gap-toothed child squinting into the sun on the floor by a desk she'd just emptied. The girl she hadn't let herself think about. The daughter behind the excuse she'd swatted out of the air. She stood in the doorway of her own hospital and felt the ground of her certainty give way beneath her, and she could not look away from the man she'd thrown out that morning, running a war she hadn't known how to fight. Saving lives she'd been ready to let him be dragged away from with his own child, now speeding toward the doors because the fever she'd called an excuse had turned out to be real. Outside, the last of the ambulances kept coming. Inside, the number of the living held where Caleb was holding it. And somewhere on the road, between a neighbor's couch and these doors, a small girl with a burning forehead was crying for her father, getting closer by the minute. The last gurney came through the doors just as the light outside was starting to go long and gold, and it carried the patient that nearly broke the rhythm Caleb had fought all morning to build. The crew had found this one deepest in the wreckage freed last, and the man had been slowly bleeding somewhere inside his chest the whole time they'd worked to reach him. He arrived with numbers that gave no time for anything. No imaging, no consult, no gathering of 3 physicians around a light box to agree on a plan. He was minutes from gone, and the only thing between him and gone was a decision made by one person immediately without permission to be wrong. Caleb read him in a single glance and knew it had to be now on this floor, with these hands, or not at all. He called for what he needed, and he opened the man's chest right there in the resuscitation bay, faster than anyone in the room had ever seen it done, his hands finding the source of the bleed by feel, because there was no time to find it any other way. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't have worked. It was the kind of thing that only works when the person doing it has done it before, in worse conditions with less, and simply does not carry the option of hesitation. Miranda watched from the doorway where she'd been rooted for what felt like hours, and what she felt. Watching it was not admiration, or not only. It was the collapse of something she'd built her whole self on. She had come to Crestview General believing that a hospital was a system that if the procedures were right, and the schedules were kept, and the rules had teeth, then the machine would run, and the outcomes would follow. She had fired this man in the name of that belief, and now she stood watching the entire system. She trusted all its procedure and hierarchy and discipline hang by a single thread, and the thread was a man she had thrown out with the morning trash. Every rule she'd enforced would have had him in the parking lot right now. Every policy she was so proud of would have let this last patient die. The only thing keeping the man on the table alive was the one variable her system had been built to eliminate. She had never in her life been so completely, publicly, unarguably wrong. And it was in the middle of that unraveling that she heard the small voice behind her. "Where's my dad?" Miranda turned. A neighbor she didn't know stood just inside the lobby out of breath, apologizing to no one in particular that half the roads were closed around the collapse, and it had taken her the better part of an hour to get across town. She was holding the hand of a little girl who was flushed and glassy-eyed, with fever, a blanket half fallen off her shoulders. 8 years old, gap-toothed. And Miranda's whole body went cold because she knew that face. She had seen it that morning, for less than a second, in a photograph on the floor by an empty desk, and she had walked past it and refused to let it weigh anything at all. Sophie. The excuse. The excuse had a face, and the face was here small and frightened, and burning up, asking for her father, across a lobby full of the people her father was busy saving. Every abstraction Miranda had hidden behind that morning fell away at once. A hospital cannot run on one man's excuses. She had said that. She had been so satisfied with how it sounded. And here was the excuse as sick child with her father's eyes, and there was the father 20 feet away with his hands inside a dying man's chest, because he had chosen the strangers on his floor over running to her, and had found a way, even then, to bring his daughter to the only place he could keep an eye on her. Miranda did not decide to move so much as find that she already had. She crossed to the child and went down to her level, and whatever part of her had spent 6 months managing a building by the numbers was simply not the part that was operating now. "You're Sophie," she said, and her voice came out unlike the voice she used in that building. "Your dad's here. He's right here. He's working, but he's here, and I'm going to get someone to help you feel better while he finishes. Okay, you're not alone." She waved down the runner nurse, the same one who'd been carrying Caleb's words across the room all morning, and got the girl into a chair, a real assessment, a cool cloth the fever addressed. She did it herself, or made sure it was done. This woman who an hour before would have called a feverish child in her lobby a distraction from operations. And she stayed near the girl, one hand on the small, hot shoulder, and turned so that she could watch the father work and the daughter both. And she understood fully finally with a clarity that would not leave her for the rest of her life exactly what she had tried to throw away that morning to impress a board with her discipline. At the table the numbers turned. The bleed was found and stopped. The pressure came up, the thread held. The last patient was going to live. By the time the light outside had gone from gold to a deep bruised blue, it was over. The floor that had been a slaughterhouse at mid-morning was by evening merely exhausted, blood being mopped, equipment being counted, staff sitting down in doorways because their legs had finally stopped believing in them. And the number that moved through the building from mouth to mouth in the disbelieving tone of people who had watched it happen and still couldn't credit it was 37. 37 people carried in off that collapse who were going to walk out of this hospital instead of leaving through the basement. 37, and everyone who'd been on that floor knew without anyone needing to say it whose morning it had been. The revelation when it finally came from one of the saved. Among the wounded who could now sit up was a man of about 61, of the last to be stabilized, who had been watching Caleb move through the room for the last stretch of it, with a strange, fixed attention, as though working something loose from an old part of his memory. As Caleb passed his stretcher, stripping off a pair of gloves, the man caught his sleeve with what strength he had, and his voice, though weak, carried in the quieting room. "Hartman." His eyes were wet. "Dr. Hartman, I knew it was you. The way you ran this, I've only ever seen one kind of man run a scene like that." His grip tightened. "The field unit. Overseas. You were the surgeon who kept us alive in that tent when everything went wrong all at once. I never forgot a face from that place. Not one." The room, or what was left of it standing, went quiet in a different way than it had all day. So there it was, out loud. At last, the thing the badge in his box had stood for, and the thing the whole floor had been quietly asking. Since he'd walked in and started speaking a language none of them knew. The doctor they'd written off as unreliable. The one who couldn't get to work on time had learned to run a mass casualty in the worst rooms on Earth. He'd carried it in silence for years precisely, so no one would look at him the way they were all looking at him now. And the man who couldn't keep it a secret any longer was one of the lives he'd just saved. Caleb didn't make a speech about it. He put a hand over the older man's hand briefly and told him to rest, and that was all. But the room had heard, and the room would not forget, and the story of who he actually was would be through the whole hospital by morning, whether he wanted it or not. Miranda came to him near the end, when the runner nurse had finally taken Sophie's fever down to something that let the girl doze in a chair with the blanket tucked right, and the immediate danger had drained out of the building. She stood in front of the man she'd fired that morning and made herself look at him, at the blood-dried dark across his scrubs, at the exhaustion sitting on him like a coat at the badge she now understood had been in that box on the hood of his car the whole time. She had rehearsed a great many confident sentences in her life. She didn't have one for this. "Why did you come back?" It was the only thing she could find, and it came out smaller and more honest than anything she'd said in 6 months. "After what I did this morning, after I tried to have them drag you out of here. You didn't owe this place anything. You didn't owe me anything. So why?" Caleb looked at her for a moment, and then past her to the chair where his daughter slept, and then back. "Because the people who came in on those trucks didn't do anything to me," he said. "There was no heat in it, which somehow made it land harder. Whatever happened in your office this morning was between you and me. It was never between them and me. They were just people who were going to die if nobody who knew how to help walked through that door." He shrugged a tired motion. "I knew how. That's the whole answer. There isn't a better one. Miranda took that the way you take a blow you've earned, and know you've earned." She looked over at Sophie again, at the gap-toothed girl from the photograph, now real and sleeping and safe under a hospital blanket in the lobby of the building that had almost cost her a father over 12 minutes. "I saw her picture this morning," she said. "On the floor by your desk. I walked right past it. I told you a hospital couldn't run on one man's excuses, and I had already walked past a photograph of the reason you were late, and I didn't let it mean anything because it was easier not to." She made herself hold his eyes. "I was wrong. Not the small kind of wrong you fix with an apology and move on. The kind that should have gotten people killed today, and only didn't, because you're a better man than the one I decided you were in 2 minutes. She reached into the folder she'd been carrying, the one that had felt so important that morning, and she took out the copy of the termination, and she tore it once cleanly in front of him and everyone close enough to see. "That's void," she said, "as of now. But I know that's not enough, and I'm not going to insult you by pretending a torn piece of paper fixes what I did." Her voice steadied into something that sounded less like a CEO and more like a person. "So I'm going to fix the thing that let me do it." Starting Monday, I'm opening a full review of every disciplinary policy in this hospital, every rigid, thoughtless rule that let a woman with a spreadsheet decide a man's worth in the time it takes to sign a page. It's going to take a while to do it right. I'd rather do it right than do it fast, which is the exact opposite of everything I believed when I walked in this morning. She didn't ask him to forgive her. She seemed to understand that asking would have been one more thing taken. She simply let the torn paper be the start of the work and left it there. A few weeks later, the review Miranda had promised was real and underway, and the hospital that came out the other side of it was a slightly more human place than the one that had gone in, a place where a doctor's record could hold the whole of a person, and not just the column that said, late. The nurses who'd looked away that morning found small ways to make up for it. The board got a very different report than the one Miranda had planned to write, and to her own surprise, she no longer cared whether they liked it, and Caleb went back to work. Not as a legend, whatever the story that now ran through the building said about him. Not as the war surgeon or the man who saved 37 lives. He came back as what he had always been, and always wanted to be seen as a doctor picking up a morning shift, who did his daughter's hair before school, and counted the red lights between the elementary school and the ambulance bay, and slipped in a few minutes past the hour some days, because that is the arithmetic of raising a child alone. Only now when he did, no one wrote it in a column. They knew what the man was made of. He'd shown them once on the worst day the building had ever seen, and they didn't need him to prove it again by being early. He kept the older man on his mind, the one from the 2 gurneys and the one ventilator the wedding ring worn thin the hand that had gone still under his. He always would. That was the price of the morning that no torn letter could refund, and he didn't try to set it down because a man who stops feeling the ones he couldn't save has lost the thing that made him able to save the rest. He carried it the way he carried the badge, quietly without display, as part of who he was. On his first morning back, he clipped his reactivated badge to his coat, walked Sophie to her classroom door, and watched until she was safely inside, and then drove to the hospital, counting the lights unhurried. Somewhere in the building above him, a family he would never meet was getting the news that the person they loved had come through the collapse and was going to be all right, was going home because of a decision made by a single father who had very nearly been thrown away over 12 minutes. He clocked in, he picked up the first chart of the day, and Dr. Caleb Hartman went back to work.